How to block knitting. Hi everyone, Norman here. I hold a little swatch here in between my hands. Quite wonky. And this is the exact same swatch after blocking. Look at the difference. So if you've ever wondered what blocking is and how it's done properly, then keep on watching. I'll share why it works and then the exact process I use for every single one of my projects, step by step. And all my tips and secret little tricks along the way so your knitting can look like this. No matter if you're knitting socks, a shawl, a hat, sweaters, if you're knitting with cotton, acrylic or sheep wool. Let's dive right into it and show you how to block knitting. First of all, what is blocking? At its core, blocking is nothing else but washing your knitting, pinning it into shape and then letting it dry. But how does this work? Well, did you ever go to bed with wet hair? In the morning you were probably sporting something in between a mohawk and a poodle. Or maybe you have curly hair and then you used heat to straighten things. Well, both things are essentially blocking. So let's take a moment and look at the chemistry behind this process so you understand why you are doing all these steps to block your knitting. Now, the important fact here is that animal hairs behave quite differently when wet. So if you take a look at a single strand of yarn and ply it apart, you would notice that it is made out of thousands of little hairs. If you zoom in a little bit closer, then you would see that each single strand of hair is composed out of thousands of thin strands of keratin, microscopic strands of keratin bundled together. You actually may have seen this, well, not really seen this, but noticed it if you ended up with split ends. Now, if you were to zoom in even closer, then you would notice that these strands of keratin are held together by disulfide bonds. So there are disulfide bonds here, a little bit of chemistry here, disulfide bonds holding these together. Now you can break them with a perm or so, but that's not what matters here. In addition, they are also held together by weaker hydrogen bonds. And you can break them whenever hair gets wet. You break these hydrogen bonds, and that is the basic idea behind blocking. So all of you will probably have observed this, at least those with curly or slightly curly hair. You dip your curls into water, and suddenly the curls are all gone. But when things dry up again, new bonds will be formed and the hair will or might keep their new shape. So that's the principle behind any hair curler. So you wet your hair, you curl them up, you let them dry, and then you will have nice and lovely curls. Or the opposite principle, you have curls, you heat them, you evaporate these hydrogen bonds, and then it will be straight. There are two other important effects that come in play. Hairs behave differently underwater. So if I dip this brush into a pot of water, notice how the tip is all pointy, and then I dip it in and things spread out and the hairs can move around a lot more freely. If you have long hairs, and you might have observed this when you go snorkeling or scuba diving, and underwater you look like the Medusa herself. And the other thing that will happen is a problem for you as a knitter. There are little scales covering the surface of the hair. And when wet and warm, these scales will lift up. And they will do that on every single strand of hair. They will kind of, lift up in that direction. And then when you rub two hairs against each other, these scales will interlock and create felt. And if you ever try to ply apart dreadlocks, you know that this process is pretty much permanent. So let's apply these principles to our knitting and block a little swatch here together. Here is my sheep wool swatch, and the process that I'm going to show you now will only work for animal fibers. If you are using plant-based fibers like cotton or linen or artificial fibers like nylon or acrylic, this won't work. I'll talk about the alternatives later on in this video. Step number 1, let your finished project soak in lukewarm water. Not hot water, but only lukewarm. I'm using this little container here, but you could of course do this in your bathtub, your sink, or wherever. You can apply some mild soap, some even use shampoo, but there are also special wool detergents you can use. Now, some fibers will require spinning oils to be processed, and this will remove these as well as any other debris still locked in the yarn. Just put it in your container. Now, it's very important that you use only a mild soap, as there is a third kind of bond keeping the tiny individual keratin strands held together. Those are salt bonds, and they can break when there's a drastic pH change. And that's one of many reasons why we don't wash our hair with acids. Now, also remember that heat, now before I showed you that heat will let those little scales lift up. So you don't want this water to be boiling hot, and you don't want to stir this around wildly, because this will make the hairs rub against each other and you would felt your little fabric. Just let it soak in. However, I typically stretch things gently. So here in this suspended state in the water, I do feel you can positively influence your stitch definition and let your fabric balance out. The key here is be gentle, no overstretching, definitely no rubbing, and definitely no heat, or a combination of these factors. And then you can let it soak for 30 minutes or so. Now, if you ended up with, say, a sock or mittens that are too tight, you could let it soak overnight and then stretch things out in the morning, maybe add some warmth to it, but typically that's not needed. Once you're satisfied, you have to rinse things using cold water. You could, of course, just drain the water. I am using a separate container here. Now, important, you have to avoid any sock temperature contrast, so don't pour cold water on a steaming hot sock. This too will risk felting. Since we started here with lukewarm water anyway, things cooled down in the past 30 minutes, so it typically shouldn't be a problem. Again, be gentle. Of course, we want to get rid of any soap still in the fabric, just like you rinse your hair after shampooing them. And next, you need to wring things out. So remember, you absolutely need to avoid rubbing, any sort of rubbing. So just gently press things. Don't wring or rub. Be gentle. I mean, your socks they won't felt because you rubbed them once. So don't behave like you were working with, eggshells or so. But please, no brute force either. Next, spread your project out on a towel, and very important, while you transfer it from your bathtub or your sink, support the full weight of the project and don't just pick it up here on one side. Your wet project will be a lot heavier, and if you pick it up, your sweater up like this, you will risk stretching out these stitches past the point of redemption, and that's probably not what you want. And then I typically create a little roll like so and gently press this. If it's a larger project, I will apply the pressure with my feet on the ground. Very, very important. Never roll this, wring it, or rub it, and never do this while your project is still warm. If you ever were to visit Kyrgyzstan, you'd see the locals using a very similar technique and roll to create felt. Now the towel will pick up most of the moisture, and this means it will dry faster, and it's also lighter, making it a lot easier to handle during the actual blocking process. And this is why this step is quite important. So, and you will notice after this towel trick that your swatch is almost dry to the touch, and there's still a lot of moisture stored inside the yarn. If you notice it's still wet, then use a different towel to wick away the rest of the moisture. Next, I spread my project out on a blocking board. These are special blocking boards available in most knitting shops. I'll put a link in the description below. I love them because you can assemble them in any desired shape, and it's foam. So it's a lot easier to pin things into shape, and of course this grid here helps to keep things straight. You can also use a towel on a carpet, your bed, or you could even use your ironing board, but if you are in for the long term, blocking boards are definitely a good investment. You also need pins, and any pins will serve. I would say the finer the better. I personally actually have a little issue with these T-pins here, as they are quite thick and more likely to destroy a project knitted in a finer gauge. There are also blocking wires and blocking combs, but more on that later. Next, I will spread my project out and only roughly pin it to my blocking mats and into the desired shape, just using a couple of pins. So I start at the corners and then add a little pin here and a little pin there, and roughly pin it into shape. And then I take a step back and look at my project, and then I will add more pins and readjust the old pins. So until I'm satisfied. So I will remove them and add a pin here, maybe a pin here. This one isn't straight yet, so that's my process. One little pin at a time. And then I'll take another step back and look at it maybe from a different perspective and check if I'm happy or maybe I'm not. And then I act as if spilling those pins was part of the process, and I adjust things further. You know, one little pin at a time. And I try to get all these lines straight and, you know, avoid little spikes here from forming and so on. Now here I am blocking a sweater, and you can see how long this process can take. For a big project like a sweater or a lace shawl, I really take my time and do this diligently. Now, as you are watching me blocking this sweater, you probably already have a couple of questions, and I want to address them one by one. First of all, it's called blocking, not stretching. The point of blocking is not stretching things out as far as possible. The fabric doesn't need to be under tension either. This will potentially just ruin things for good, because once those stitches are stretched out, you could only fix things by going into each and every little stitch and readjusting the diameter of each stitch with your knitting needle, and that's probably not what you want. Instead, what you see here on the blocking board should be the kind of gauge you want your finished project to have. So if you like this look and feel of the fabric, that's what you get. And if you don't, you need to readjust things. And if you are knitting, say, a sweater, a lot of patterns or modern patterns come with measurements. So you can definitely use your tape and check things. I mean, I'm definitely stretching things out a bit, but not until the fabric won't stretch no more. Secondly, use a lot of pins. If you have large stretches of unsupported fabric, you will typically end up with these permanent spikes. Probably not what you want. I mean, if you're knitting a lace shawl also, sometimes this can be exactly what you want, but I will, for all other projects, I use, as you can see, I use a lot of pins. And then whenever I see one of these spikes or little curves, I will add another pin to avoid exactly that from happening until I am satisfied with my edge. One little pin at a time. Also, pay attention where exactly you insert these pins. So if things look like this, that's probably a situation I would want to avoid. So I also don't go right into the edge stitches, because then you will wear out here these loops. Instead, I will typically go a little bit further in, and I try to go right through the stitches without splitting the yarn. Remember, if you do it like this, once this is dry, this is the way things will stay put. It will not magically alter its shape one more time. It might spring back a little bit, but other than that, if you mess up your edges by pinning things unevenly, it will stay that way, at least until you wash it again. So try to go into full stitches and not fold the edge upon itself or something like that, or split the yarn or wear out individual loops. This should be one straight line, at least as far as this is possible. If you are blocking larger projects, make sure that you even out the center as well. So I typically glide across the fabric. You should be able to see that these knit columns here align, and there is not, like I tried here, over here, that there is no bias or a little welt or something like that. And if you do notice these imbalances, you try to stretch things out. And maybe, what sometimes happens here, this is ribbing, and here you have stockinette stitch, and then there's this sort of curve. And what you can always do is you can add a couple of a couple of well-placed pins here right in the middle of your fabric to ensure that this portion of the fabric stays put while things dry up. So that is another little trick for you. For very large projects, you can also use these blocking combs here. These are produced by Knit Pro or Knitter's Pride, how they are marketed in the US. And these make it so much faster to block things, because here, just one little click and you have a straight line. So very efficient, for lace shawls, blankets, and that kind of project. Now I typically still prefer pins because I have a little bit more control over, the exact placement of each little pin, but there's no denying this is a lot faster. Once you've pinned your project into the desired shape, let it dry. Do remember to be patient. Wool tends to be dry to the touch before all water evaporated. Depending on the temperature in your home and the yarn you have been using, this typically takes at least a day. And try to avoid speeding things up by blocking outside. Direct sunlight can bleach out colors. If you are washing your bed sheets, it's probably what you want, but maybe not for your precious Fair Isle sweater with plant-based dyes. And once your project is dry, you can just remove the pins and wear it with pride. There's nothing else you need to do, just remove the pins. And then this will be the result, a nice square little swatch with a nice and neat even stitch definition. do know that through the humidity in the air and when you wear things, well, you always sweat a little bit, so it might lose its shape over time, but then you can just re-block things one more time. Now there's another big issue I need to address. Blocking projects knit in the round. This typically means socks, hats and sweaters. And the problem is that these don't have any edges. They are round after all. So if you block your socks or a hat like this, the result will often be permanent fold lines here at, the edges. And for a hat like this, that's actually what I wanted, because I wanted the crown here to stand up like this. However, typically it is not. And in this case, I really urge you to go to the hardware shop and get some of these foam cords. They are typically used for caulking, to close the gaps around a window or so and that kind of stuff. They're super cheap, like $5 or so, and you can insert them into your sleeves, hats or socks, and then pin around them. They're foam after all, and you can insert your pins right through that and avoid that fold line. So super nice. For socks, you can also buy special blocking boards like this one here. Just, go to Etsy. You will find tons of different options in many different materials. Make sure to pick one with a well-rounded edge. If the edge of the board is either too thin or too sharp, you may have gained convenience, but you will also end up with a fold line. The problem is, of course, that you will need a different blocking board for each size, or a much more expensive adjustable blocking board. You can also block hats around a balloon. Pump it up so it's about the size of your head or the head of the intended wearer and put it on. Be careful, this typically just works for rather tight-fitting skull cap kind of fits. If you want a slouchier fit or a slouchier beanie, then the balloon is typically not long enough, or you end up overstretching the middle, so be careful. I do have to say that I personally still prefer these foam cords. They are so much more versatile. A sock blocking board won't work for sleeves, and neither will the balloon trick do the job. By contrast, you can use these foam cords for literally every tubular project. Just make sure to pick some that are as thin as possible, and if you feel they are too thick, you could always cut them in half using a pair of scissors. We have one important issue left to discuss. As I said in the introduction, and this process here only works for animal or rather hairy fibers. This means sheep wool, cashmere, yak, camel hair, alpaca, and so on. It doesn't work for cotton or linen, hemp, nettle, and these kind of plant-based fibers, or artificial fibers like nylon or acrylic. Simply because the bonds holding these fibers together are different. But you still have options, and the next part is all about them. Cotton, like this little swatch here, is relatively easy to block. Cotton will retain its shape after it dried, so after all, your typical t-shirt ends up crinkled after washing. Cotton is, however, also extremely non-elastic and doesn't spring back the way wool does. So you may have had a worn-out t-shirt before, right? And no matter what you tried, you couldn't get it back into shape. At the same time, cotton can also soak up a lot of water, and that's why it's used in sportswear. This means if you wet block your sweater, the way I showed you before, you risk stretching out your project too much due to the heavy weight, and since it's non-elastic, it will never spring back into shape. So that's why I typically use a steamer to block my cotton. So I pin things, this is dry, and I pin things in shape. And then once I pinned everything into shape, I will use a steamer like this one here. I'll put a link in the description below to block things. Now, I hope this doesn't fog up my lens. Maybe it does. It's also a little bit louder. and I go over it quite a little bit. Now it's important to do this on a rather low to medium heat setting. Cotton will shrink if you apply too much heat. That's not what you want. If you don't have a steamer, or some irons also have a steam function, what you could do is you could block things into shape and then use a diffuser to spray things. Over time it will essentially do the same thing. A lot of cleaning agents for the household come in these diffuser kind of bottles. You could just, you could keep them, and after you used everything up, rinse it thoroughly and use this to spray things. And once this is dry, this typically just takes a couple of minutes, because after all, this steam will evaporate. It's warm, or hot rather. It will evaporate very, very quickly. And then this swatch here will look nice and neat. If you ever wondered why my swatches for my videos, because this is the yarn that I'm using, why they look so nice and neat, and this is the exact reason. See, this will be nice and square. You can use this steaming process to block artificial fibers as well. So here, this is a nylon and acrylic blend. Just pin things into shape and then use a steamer to block things. Go over it. Very important, this will effectively melt the fibers into place. So this here is a non-reversible process. Whenever you apply heat to acrylic or nylon, it will melt the fibers and they will stay put. So again, avoid too high temperatures. You don't want to end up with plastic slack or so. Wet blocking, however, wet blocking will work for cotton. It will do nothing for acrylic yarn, or rather not a lot. Maybe it will even things out a tiny little bit, but it will not retain its shape. So this is your only option. Heat is your only option when it comes to artificial fibers like this one here. And here one more time, as you can see, as I remove these pins, my little swatch will stay that way. Now, of course, it does spring back a little bit, but this steaming, I do feel that steam blocking is often the better way, as it just doesn't risk outstretching the fabric too much. See? And then of course we need to talk about linen, nettle, and these kind of fibers obtained from the stalks of plants, as opposed to cotton, which is obtained from the seed, and they behave differently yet. So they don't felt, that's the good news, but they are also typically a little bit more on the stiffer and a little bit more on the rustic side. So treating them a little bit rougher will actually often loosen them up. Something you may have noticed when you have actual linen cloths, bed sheets and that kind of stuff. At first they may be a little bit coarser, but after washing them 10 times or so, they really start to soften up. So temperatures work, as does the application of mechanical force. So let it soak in hot water, rinse it with cold water, crinkle things and repeat. And after you've done this 10 times or so, it might be a lot softer. So this means linen and nettle I actually wet block as well. Let it soak. Again, stretch it out a little bit. No, don't overstretch. Let it soak. But this time, you can't see this obviously. This time I would use a lot warmer water. Actually, I mean not boiling hot, but maybe 60 degrees or so. And then obviously be careful with your hands, and then I would add, of course, you can add mild soap, and then add some temperature shock. So as you rinse this, use cold water, and then maybe even repeat it. And then again, as you pull this out of your sink or so, be careful, support the fabric, and then And then you can, wringing and knitting out is never a good idea. So again, press it gently, place it between a towel the way I showed you before, and then you can put it on your blocking mat. There are two important differences I need to mention in this context. Even if you do the towel trick, this will still feel a bit wet as opposed to sheep wool. If you place it between a towel and press it a little bit, it will come out of the towel almost dry to the touch. Linen or so will still feel wet. And the second, and that's probably the more important difference is here. As I said, plant-based fibers are non-elastic or typically non-elastic, and this means they are also a lot more unforgiving. So if you block your sheep wool swatch like this, and you have a tiny little spike, typically, well, it will spring back and you don't notice it. With linen, this would stay, so you have to place those pins a lot more diligently and really make sure that you don't stretch out any individual stitches, that these lines are straight. So do take your time and don't overstretch this. Now important, if you don't want to soften up your fabric, you don't need to wet block linen or so. It's not a requirement. You can also steam block it, and typically it will retain its shape. So you can do that, and I have done this before, and it works passably well. Now here's another little tip I need to mention in this context. If you want to speed things up, so the drying process, you could actually use your blow dryer and go across it. This will obviously apply heat, so be careful. It will also speed things up. So there's a lot of things happening. So typically I wouldn't do this for acrylic or for cotton or for sheep wool, but for linen or nettle, this is definitely something to consider. If your blow dryer does have a cold setting, then you can use it for any other fiber as well. After all, sheep wool is just hair as well, so why wouldn't your blow dryer work on that to speed things up? So that's just a little tip I felt like mentioning because I used it for this swatch. So as you can see, if I remove these pins, my swatch will stay put. So this works as well. Again, see here, I was a little bit the result was a spike. So in this case, I mean, for me, this is just a swatch, but probably should have placed one or two more pins there to achieve a neater edge. Let's take a look. So you see here, my result was some spikes, and even if I stretch things out, these stay, so be careful. Now here's one last little tip or trick. A lot of people also see good results when they actually iron their linen fabrics. I'm gonna put this away for a second so we can appreciate what we have so far. So this is the way things look now. Can you see this? And we are gonna iron this in a second now. So I'll just go across this and iron this, not with the biggest pressure. My iron actually has a steam function, so I could actually do this, but I'm not. And I'm just ironing this on the linen setting if you have it. So that's typically actually the highest temperature most irons have. That's what is reserved for linen. So let's take a look. As you can see, this is a lot flatter. However, what most people like about this process is that a lot of linen fabrics are a little bit irregular, so they don't have the nicest stitch definition. And by ironing things, you smoothen things out, and often the appearance can be a little bit more regular. Again, be careful, because you flatten the stitches, it's very easy to damage your fabric beyond redemption. at the end of the day, and that's why we are back here in my studio, you have to understand that each fiber, but even each yarn, even if it's the same fiber, will behave differently. Maybe it was chemically treated to be a superwash yarn. Maybe it was spun in a different way. Some, typically hand-spun yarns, but some hand-spun yarns are actually slightly felted. And depending on all these treatments, the way you need or you can block a swatch or a project will be different. And of course, preferences differ on top of that. So if you are still unsure what to do and how to block your project, and you have a little spare yarn, just knit a small, doesn't really have to be big, a small tiny little swatch or two and try things on. And of course, if you've knitted a swatch to obtain gauge, you can of course use that. And by the way, that is just one of many reasons why you should knit that swatch. You can also use this to find out how the fiber, how the fabric behaves after blocking and which process you can use. And then try to steam block this, try to wet block this, use heat, don't use heat, stretch things very far or not, and maybe iron it or not, and then see what you like best. And sometimes leaving things the way they are this can also be an option. There are quite a lot of exotic fibers or novelty yarn that look better the way they are. Take fake fur, for example. A teddy bear typically never looks better after washing. Cleaner maybe, but typically not better. Anyway, that's how to block knitting. Comment below if you still have any questions. Subscribe to my channel if you don't want to miss any new videos. And as always, happy knitting and enjoy the rest of your day.